Hello, this is John Wassam. I'm the RPS and APS Program Manager for DUER. This is the compliance filing webinar for the 220 Massachusetts RPS APS CES compliance filing. We'll get going in a moment. We'll just wait for other people in. We're just waiting. We'll start in 1 minute. Just waiting for people to pop in. They're a couple minutes late. Okay, I think we'll get started. As I said, I'm some RPS and APS program manager with DUER, which oversees this compliance filing. With me, I have Emily from the Department of Environmental Protection, which oversees the CES program. And I also have Sue Ann Richard, Mass DEP, who oversees the greenhouse gas emissions compliance page, which is part of this workbook and filing. First, we'll go through some things that are new this year. First, the compliance filing process. DUER emailed out the 2018 and 19 bank certificates that were available to LSEs. We did that in April. The official retail load obligation for each LSE was emailed in May. You will have to use that retail load obligation in your filing unless you can document or provide other information that it should be different. The compliance workbook, I'm sorry, it's been a little delayed. It will be posted today on the website, and I will mail it out to all the LSCs of record that we have today. Just a reminder that the end of the 2020 trading year is midnight on June 15th. All certificates should be settled into your Massachusetts sub-account by that time. For the ACP process, again this year, there's one process for RPS, APS, and CPS that you would submit those payments to the Mass CEC. We're requesting that it be Friday, June 25th, so that they can turn around and send a receipt to you. The receipt to be submitted with your filing. And again, if if you are paying all, if you have no ACP payments, there's no receipt required. The separate process, ACPs for the clean energy standard must be submitted to the Mass DEP. After the filing, within 30 days of the filing, July 1st, they will send a separate billing invoice to the LSC if they owe ACP for the CES. And payment instructions are included on that invoice. Compliance filing is due on July 1st of this year. And the filers must provide the electronic copy of their filing, GIS settlement reports, and the Mass CEC ACP receipt with their filing. And all filings go to doer.rps@mass.gov. One of the major changes this year, notarization will not be the authorization form. We also have eliminated the requirement to mail a hard copy with the wet signature, so that will no longer be required. Our preference is to that the authorized person will sign the certification and authorization, so you would print those out, they would sign it, you would scan it and save as a PDF and email that back with your filing. That's our preference, so that we have a signed record of the filing workbook. But the notarization and the hard copy are not required this year. What's new? Continued. As we said, when we sent out the bank certificates for the Clean Energy Standard 2019 bank certificates cannot be used for compliance this year. They will be available for compliance in 2021. This is in the regulations where it says at the beginning of their banking section, beginning in one, then it goes on to say that retail suppliers will be able to use the banking from the prior 2 years. But if you banked CES certificates last year, that cannot be used for any compliance this year. Again, another change for the CPS, there's no load exemption this year for the CES, as there was in the prior 2 years. One other change in the RPS Class 1, there is a new load exemption for contracts executed or extended before 1/1/2019, which was when we increased the minimum standard from going up by 1% a year to 2% a year. So I've shown here what happens in both 2020 and 2021. If you have exempt load, the minimum standard for that load in 2020 will be 15%, and the non-exempt load is 16%. In 2021, this is the change. This still goes up by 1%. So the exempt load would be subject to 16% in 2021, and 18% in 2021. So that was because of the change from going from 1% per year to 2% per year. In the Clean Peak standard, there is a minimum standard. Other than 0 this year, it is 1.5%. There is a new tab in the workbook for CPS compliance. CPS also has a load exemption for contracts executed or extended before 1/1/2020. So the exempt load has a minimum standard of 0% this year, and any non-exempt load has to meet the requirement of the 1.5%. There is a slight change in reporting of the settlement of your certificates. The CPS is under a different reporting. So any LSC that settled CPEC certificates will have to access the My Massachusetts CPS CPEC retirements report under your account holder reports and report their settled CPEC certificates in CSV format, just like you do for the other settled certificates. We'll address this a little bit later too when we get to settled certificates. Going to bank certificates, banking has not changed. The limits are still the same as last year. Mostly CPS can be used for the following 2 years, except for CPS, which allows bank certificates to be used for the following 3 years. The CPS banking limit is 30%. And the only other exception, of course, is the 2019 bank CES certificates cannot be used for compliance this year. But again, banking will be allowed in CES. Again, going over the settled certificates, they must be settled in your Massachusetts subaccounts by June 15th. Any SREC or SREC 2 remitted certificates that is being applied to your compliance obligation must be settled within the Massachusetts subaccount. Also, if you intend to bank any certificates subject to the banking limit, you be sure to include those surplus certificates in your settled account. They will automatically be calculated for the banked amount in the workbook. This is, again, we're saying that there are 2 separate reports that will have to be filed for settled certificates. One for CPECs, and you would use the report that I identified above, and one for everything else, which is under the My Certificates Disposition Report. In this report, be sure when you submit the My Certificates Disposition, just make sure you click on Settled. That's an option on the report. We don't need to know the other certificates that you hold or their disposition. We're only interested in the settled certificates. And also, GIS now allows you to provide the entire year in one report, as formerly a couple of years ago it was quarter by quarter, but that has been eliminated. You do have the option to use the 1 year. You can go from Q1 to Q4 of 2020, and that is the report that we required, the entire year of settled certificates. Just a note about unsettled and other errant certificates. If there are issues with some certificates, we do have an Errant Report. It is tab 4 of the workbook, and you can put down any certificates that are wayward or are not. They might have not been qualified as renewable, but they are. And that's where you would document those. One thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is we urge you to use the chat to have questions. We're going to hold the questions till the end if possible, but use the chat box to enter your questions and we'll respond to all questions at the end of this webinar. Solar carve-out. It's much the same as it was last year. 2018 auction SRECs must be used for 2020 compliance. 2019 auction SRECs may be used for 20 or 2021. This is the same for SREC 2 reminted auction certificates. If you're not going to use an auction certificate in 2021, it should remain in your main GIS account or your bank account, but I don't believe you should leave it in your bank account after Q4 because it will disappear. But you should not place them in your Massachusetts sub-account, otherwise we will count them towards compliance. So just a reminder that they do not get moved there. And also, reminted SREC or SREC 2s are not considered bank certificates, so you would not show them in the bank certificate columns on the workbook. They should be listed with your any other 2020 certificates that you had for SREC or SREC 2. This explains a little bit about the exemption in the carve out for SREC. So in the SREC solar carve out, there's still contracts that were executed or extended before 6/28/2013. I think there were 0 load exempted in 2019, so I would not expect that to be the case again, but one never knows. And that has a lower minimum standard of 0.9867%. And then contracts executed or extended on or after 6/28/13 meet the minimum standard of 1.6116%. Same story a little bit for solar carve out, although it has 3 levels. For contracts executed or extended before 4/25/14, this has a minimum standard of 0%. Then there's a second level for executed or extended on or after 4/25/14, but before 5/8/2016. This has a lower minimum standard of 2.2040% for 2020. Contracts that were executed or extended on or after 5/8/2016, the minimum standard is 3.8011%. So that's no change. The minimum standards have changed, but the workings of it has not. The SREC auctions, we'll hold an auction this year before the end of July. We do not expect significant volumes. There's not been a significant volume in SREC 1 or SREC 2 for the last 2 years. All SRECs must be deposited into the auction account by June 15th. So that's important. So before then, you would have to register with our representative, our auction agent before that time and submit those SRECs and SREC 2s into the auction account by June 15th. This is an alternative way to dispose of the SRECs and SREC2s for certain suppliers and generators who wish to do so. Next, I will, our ACP payments. Again, nothing's changed except we added CPS. So ACP payments for RPS CPS should be made to the Mass CEC again. We are recommending by Friday, June 25th, so that Mass CEC has time to record the receipt of the money and issue the receipt to you, which must be included with your filing. Again, we will send the wire instructions separately by encrypted email, so you should see that shortly in the next week or so. The ACP notification is the last tab, tab N of the workbook. Again, you would email a copy of tab N to the Mass CEC at the time you make your ACP payment. And then they will send back the signed ACP receipt. And again, it's only required if you made an ACP payment. If you don't make an ACP payment, nothing is required. And again, if you have not received your receipt by July 1st, you should not delay your compliance filing and just forward the receipt at such time that you do have it. And once again this year, ACP payments for the clean energy standard follow a different process. And I believe the next page is for the clean. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily Lamb from DEP, who will discuss this slide and the CES.
Thanks, John. So hi, everyone. Just a few points about the CES this year. So as in previous years, your RPS Class 1 RECs will be counted towards your CES compliance obligation, and that's set up automatically to do that in the workbook. As John mentioned earlier, there is no contract load exemption for CES in 2020. This is the first year that there are no exemptions. So that is new this year. And then, as we've mentioned before, the ACP payment for CES, if you need to make an ACP payment, is different from the RPS process. So you don't need to pay it before submitting your workbook. You'll submit the workbook, and then Mass CEP will send an invoice to you if you owe an ACP. The invoice will have detailed information about how to make the payment, and payment is due within 30 days of the invoice. So that is all the same as previous years if you've needed to make an ACP payment. And as we'll go through in the workbook, the ACP amount that you owe under CES, if you owe anything, will be automatically calculated in Table 15 and will show up separately from what you owe under the RPS. And now I think I will hand it over to Sue-Ann for the next slide to talk about greenhouse gas reporting requirements.
Okay, hi. 4310 CMR 775, there are 2 reports that you must submit for each calendar year. The first one is the greenhouse gas tab in the workbook. You will complete that tab based on your settled certificate report. The only way you would not need to submit that report is, first of all, if you did not sell electricity in Massachusetts in 2020, or if you met your entire RPS, CES, APS requirements through the ACP payments or bank certificates with DOER. So you must complete the greenhouse gas tab if you have settled certificates with GIS. The second report isn't until about 1.5 years later. You cannot submit the second report until after we have issued the final emission factors for 2020. The second report is based on your first report information from your greenhouse gas tab and those final emission factors. We will send out an email with links to the actual AQ32 form and spreadsheet that you will fill out for that second report. I'm going to attempt to go into some detail about how to complete the first report when we get to the workbook, but please, if you have any questions, contact me. I will be happy to go through the report with you. We're on Microsoft Teams. It will probably take 10 minutes. We can screen share and we can get it right the first time. You can also leave me a voicemail at my work number. I do check that voicemail every morning. All right, I will give it back to John and Emily until we get to the workbook. Thank you.
Okay, I think this is the last slide on the webinar before we get to the workbook. This is just our contact information. If you have questions or need additional information, the webinar and a recording of the webinar will be put on, will be posted to our website, and that should happen a day or two. So if you need to go back and reference something, those will be available. Now I'm going to try to switch to let's see. I forget how to put it. I think we can see it from here. We'll just go through each page. We'll try to enter some data, but the workbook is essentially the same except for the addition of CPS, and we allow for the exemptions. You can notice down here at 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D, you would put your load exemptions on each of those pages. So hopefully this will work if I just put in supplier there. You will see that it carries through for each workbook, so we know who you are. So this is the standard information. We request a contact person, a backup person or additional contact, and who the authorized representative. The authorized representative is the person who has authority to sign the compliance workbook. And we'll get to those tabs when we get at the back end of this. So this is pretty straightforward. The next page is the supplier page. I'm just going to enter 1 million. We won't call it, well, I can call it sub-county or mass. So this is where you enter the load obligation that we sent you. If you have different sub-accounts, you would enter those here. But the different sub-accounts should equal total the load obligation that we sent out in May. Down here is, this is a tables for disposition of SRECs. So here you would enter all of your SRECs. If you had clearinghouse, I'm not going to enter data here. If you had them for voluntary, they would go here, or green product sales. And note in the pink, these SRECs would not be available for compliance. So if you put anything here, it will not. So then this Errant Certificates. So this totals the lines of 37, 38, 39 that are not eligible for compliance, and then but up here you would put all your, the total SRECs, including in reserve or other accounts. And the same goes for SREC 2s. It was just a helpful table in the past to show the disposition and allocation of your SRECs and SREC 2s. If we go to RPS Class 1, you'll see that the account shows up and the total volume. So this is for Class 1 members before 1/1/2019. So if I put in, I'll just put in 40,000 or 400,000. This would be the number of contracts. This is the total exempt load that you enter. So then it calculates what the qualified load is over here. I mean, these both will be subject to a minimum standard, but different minimum standards as we showed in the webinar. I can flip to that just to show that. Here you see the 400,000 that we showed as exempt, the 600,000. They would qualify for different amounts here based on these minimum standards, and then it calculates what the total obligation will be. But in essence, that's how it works. And I don't have anything, we're getting surplus here because we haven't entered anything for solar carve-out or short carve-out too. So it's the same for this. Going back to this, then we asked in table 2, it's going to have a different label on the actual workbook you receive, but you would put in, this is the projection of your exempt load, including line losses for future years. It's just, you're not beholden to it. It's just a projection and used for our planning purposes. But if you do the number of contracts and then the amount of the exempt load, you would include it here. So the same situation applies to all of these. The exempt load we have entered no exempt load, so it's carried over to $1 million. Same for SCO 2 and the CPS exempt. I can enter 500,000 here because it was a year later. So now the qualified is 500,000. Tab 4 is where you enter Errant Certificates. If you have any, most suppliers do not, but this is where we keep track of it on this, and then anything entered on this table gets carried forward to the relevant table here. So again, this is just how it's calculated. But if we went to SCO, now we have the obligation is 16. I'm going to enter the exact amount of certificates here. And I'm going to do the same in SCO 2, 38001. So you'll notice that the alternative compliance goes to 0 here. This is where the credits are calculated. This is the total attribute you had. No banking. This is where you enter the banking, but you do not enter the, as we said, do not enter auction certificates in these 2 columns. they would be included over here. So any SREC 2 option certificates should be included in this total. Because this all matches, there is no banking here at all. I can demonstrate that if we entered, what's my bank line? 48, 38. So if I enter 40,000 here, you can see that now my total attributes, I've settled more certificates than my obligation. So those extra certificates are automatically calculated down here. The surplus was 1989. The banking limit on this at 10% was only 3801. I'm below my banking limit, so I get to bank 1989. DOER keeps this record, and next spring we would issue the banking report, which would show you'd have 1,989 2020 bank certificates available for next year's compliance or the following year. These would be good for the following 2 years. But what I'm wanting to demonstrate is if I go back here, this was my total RPS obligation, but now I'm subtracting out what I owed in solar carve out and solar carve out 2, because they're part of class 1. They are carve outs, so they get subtracted here. So the net obligation is this amount. We still have some excess that's below the banking limit, so these would be banked for how many we entered. We didn't enter any. 101. I think I might have discovered an error. So if we go on to the other, you see the load obligation is still carried forward. This is renewed class 2 renewable. If we didn't have any certificates, you would have an alternative compliance of 32,056. And so it's just replicated throughout. This is waste to energy, 3.5% at a million is 35,000 certificates. APS, same song and dance, it's 5% this year. So you would owe 50,000, you get no certificates. CPS, we've done the same. Remember, we entered 500,000. So the obligation is 1.5% of the 5%, and the obligation would be 7,500. Again, we haven't entered any certificates here. So going, this is the CES page. It is calculating a little differently. You have a million, you start here. This is the obligation total 200,000, but remember RPS class 1 counts towards that meeting that obligation. So we had 156,000 in class 1. And so this line subtracts this number from this number, so you get 44,000. We're calling the net obligation that you would have for CES, and that's so if I entered, there is still no banking allowed, so you don't see those columns entered here. And if I had 50,000 Class 1 RECs that I used to settle. You can see that I've met the obligation. I don't have any ACP, and I have 6,000 banked, which is below the banking limit. So those all work pretty much standard. They're pretty straightforward on how it works. Now I will do this. The is the Ghg tab. I want to stress that this must be filled out. And if you have issues, as Sue Ann said, just contact her. But this must be filled out in the workbook as well. So I'll turn it over to Sue Ann, who can go through this page, filling out this page.
Thanks, John. All right, so the only reason you would not fill this out, again, is if you did entirely ACP payments or used certificates that were banked with DOER for your compliance. CPS certificates do not go on this form either. So to fill this form out, you're going to use your settled certificate report with GIS. You are going to use your filter buttons across all the columns on the top. You will go to settled certificates and you will want Massachusetts sub-account only. Once you have set the filter to those two items, there's really only about 4 other columns you need to work with to fill this report out. You go over to the right, and the first thing I would do would be to go to the Massachusetts APS column, and I would filter on yes, and then I would go look at the fuel type column, which might be O or something earlier over on the left-hand side, and look for fuel cell. Fuel cell is about the only certificate in APS that I can think of that you would put on this form. Count your fuel cell certificates, it would go in column I. You can then get rid of the set APS to no or to everything, it doesn't matter anymore. Go on over to one column over to the left, you get to RPS, the class 2 waste. Go over to your fuel type, count up your waste certificates, municipal solid waste and trash to energy. It could have either name, they go in column J. Trash or municipal solid waste certificates that show up in the APS column are for thermal or steam energy and do not belong in this report. This report is for electricity only. So I only include your class 2 WECs in this report. You can then open the class 2 WEC, filter back up, go to RPS class 2, filter on yes, you'll get hydro and possibly some landfill gas. Count those. Again, open that filter back up. You can skip over all the solar columns because all solar is also class 1. Go to your class 1, filter on yes, go to your fuel type and count up your various class 1 fuels. You'll have hydro, you'll have solar, you'll have wind. There may or may not be biogas, digester gas, and landfill gas. A little unclear on where biomass and wood is at these days. If you have any that are not APS, you can put them in here. The column F, for eligible but not mentioned. I don't anticipate anything going in that box right now. That said, sometimes the rules change and I haven't caught up, and there may be something that goes there, but please check with me first. It is very unlikely. Once you have filled in your certificate amounts in the blue boxes, this report will calculate your emissions and your megawatt hours. You will use the megawatt hours and the emissions from rows 22 and 23 for the report that you will complete in September of 2022. So hang on to the report. If you get a revised report from me, you will be using the numbers in the revised report, not the numbers from the originally submitted workbook. So there's been a lot of confusion about that in the past. It would be very helpful if we got the initial greenhouse gas tab in the workbook completed correctly the first time through. So if you have questions, please feel free to contact me. You've got my email. I believe you've got a phone number. I will get back to you. And I think that's it. And if, again, they've got a chat box up, please put questions in. I can answer anything now or whenever we get to answering questions, or you can contact me separately and I will try to help you fill out the report when it's due. Thank you.
Okay. Moving on. These are the, we didn't fill in very much certificates, so we get a high ACP here. But everything is carried forward from the workbook. So, and this is the RPS, APS, and CPS due to mass CEC. That you would pay that. This is the calculation. Right now it shows 0 that you would send to mass DP. I can show, I'll revise this to less than. So if we put 40,000 here, the banking goes away, 4,000 show up in the compliance credit column here. You have 40,000 certificates. You've got to make a payment for 4,000 ACP because you're short of the 44,000. So if we go back here, now it shows the 4,000 ACP, and this is the rate, and this is what Mass DEP would invoice you for this amount. You do not have to pay it, as Emily said, before the filing, but once the filing's given, they will turn around and invoice the supplier if any amount due, and the payment instructions are included with the invoice. I should say, we'll just skip to the ACP. This is the notification that you would email to Sarah at Mass CEC. So you would print this out and you would email this to Mass CEC when you made your payment, and then she will, or CEC will turn around, sign it, and send it back to you. And then you would send a copy of that receipt along with your filing back to DOER.RPS. So it'd be included in your filing. Once again, we said, if you don't receive the receipt, don't delay the filing, but forward it when you do have it available. The change, there's no change here. This is where the authorized representative would sign the certification form. The top half is for RPS, Alternative Energy, and Clean Peak Standard. And then the bottom part is for Mass Clean Energy Standard certification. So they have to sign it actually 3 times. This is required. This is the certification right here. And then a separate certification here. This one says that the certificates have not been sold to representative in any other jurisdiction. And this one is true and complete. And this is Mass Clean Energy for Mass DP. On the authorization page, this is signed by the authorized representative too, and what we're looking for here is by what authority does that person have authorization to sign the filing workbook. So it's an officer of the company, the position, just a short description of what the authority is given to the person who's signing the authorized representative. This is where we used to have notarization of this part, but we've eliminated that requirement. But again, it would be helpful if you printed out these 2 pages, sign them, then scan them, save to a PDF, and include the signed with your filing workbook. And finally, we get to, this is just contacts in case you need to contact us for anything regarding the filing. So with that, I can stop. And do we have any questions?
Hey, John,
Hi.
we had one question about, will the slides be emailed to the participants? And I know you mentioned posting the webinar, so I'll defer if you're going to post the slides as well.
I don't know if we'll email the slides, but it will be posted hopefully this afternoon or tomorrow, by tomorrow, to the website under the annual compliance information for suppliers subheading of the RPS. Under DOER, you go to renewable energy portfolio, and then under that, there's a compliance information for suppliers. You click on that, and everything will be posted there. So by the end of today, or by the end of this week, or early next week, the updated instructions will be there. The webinar is posted there. The webinar slides are posted there. The workbook will be posted there as well.
Okay, that was the only question I had that was in the box, John.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? On how to fill out? If not, then we will attempt to, we are going to email the workbook. I say is high likelihood by this afternoon, and we'll post it to the website as well. Along with the slides will be posted today as well to ours. So if nobody else has any questions, Emily or Sue Ann, do you have any? Or
Nope, nothing else to add. Just, feel free to reach out to us with any questions as you're filling out the workbook. And thanks, John, for walking us through everything.
okay, then I guess we'll wrap this up. And thank you for participating. And as Emily said, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out. We can help you go through the workbook and fill it out. Okay, thank you. I guess that's the end, Karen.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good